Hello, everyone, and a huge thank you to joining us today. This is a Lead Dev online panel discussion created in partnership with Chronosphere and Google Cloud. The discussion will last about 45 minutes. Writing code was never the bottleneck. If anything, AI-generated code deployed by AI agents adds more roadblocks to production and makes it harder than ever to debug. Ops and site reliability engineers are stuck being reactive. So today we're diving into observability, or O11Y, if you're cool, monitoring and operations in response to this AI boost, and where AI can help your observability move into this proactive idea. So not just observing to be reactive and to kind of anticipate change, which we hope those unknown unknowns, as it's called, but also if you have the right guardrails around it, maybe we can start using AI to help where the real bottlenecks were and to be proactive. So let's get started with some introductions. I'm Jennifer Riggins. I'm a freelance technology journalist, including with Lead Dev. And today I am joined by Rodrigue, Jason, and Ryan, ready to share their experiences and insights. So can you please introduce yourselves? Rodrigue, if you want to go first.
Sure. So my name is Rodrigue Schaefer. I'm working for Delivery Hero, one of the world's leading delivery platforms out there. And my responsibility there is mainly leading Tech Foundations, which is an internal organization that provides infrastructure and tooling for software engineers, data engineers, ML engineers, and so on, so that they can do their job more efficiently with higher quality and with higher reliability overall.
Okay, thank you very much, Rodrigue. Jason?
Hey, nice to meet everyone out there. My name is Jason Davenport. I'm an area tech lead with Google Cloud. My focus is on making sure that developers have a great developer experience when working with Google Cloud products, and that we help developers understand all the great things that they can do, and then also take friction back to our teams so we can improve the products even further. So super cool to be a part of this. Thank you, Jennifer, and the panel for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. And finally, Ryan, please.
Hi, I'm Ryan Pierce. I'm a systems engineer at Palo Alto Networks. I actually joined Palo Alto from Chronosphere, who was recently acquired to bring observability to Palo Alto's existing product portfolio. Been working in observability for about 10 years across different vendors. Really excited to talk today. We've been able to do a lot of cool work with AI vendors, companies building AI native applications. So it's a really exciting topic to dig into.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, all of you. And thank you again, listeners. So Ryan, let's kick off by I want everyone to answer this question, please. What is operations in this, to quote Taylor Swift, agentic era?
For me and for our customers, I think in the agentic era, it's switching away from having manual practitioners and operators doing every task and looking at dashboards and now understanding how to actually plug in pieces of software that are agents that can augment or take on some of those responsibilities, or even solve things that maybe the team hasn't thought about as a process ahead of time, and then being able to continually understand and iterate throughout.
Okay. Jason, what's Google's view on this? Or yours?
It's a good question. To me, observability hasn't really changed other than the fact that we now have to manage non-determinism in addition to the rest of the stack. And what I mean by that, all of the things that we've learned about and we know, from software engineering and SRE and all of those stacks, it's not that it's different, right? It's not that we're trying to do all these like new things and we have like new platforms and all this, but what it does mean is that we have to manage things that may not behave the same way every time. So how do we leverage the things that we know, take software engineering principles really to the best practice side in the extreme to manage agents and manage things that happen with agents and all this stuff with it. So I think you'll hear a lot of great things from folks here today who are implementing that, but a lot of it is, right, how do we just manage the non-determinism with the things that we have or extending them so we can also manage it as a part of that.
I guess we could objectively say it could be harder in this time period.
Yeah, I think you could say, on the one hand, it's harder. On the other hand, take even the example of a dashboard. One of the things we always struggle with a dashboard is the last mile of delivery. With agents, it makes that last mile, hard easier, right? Because we can have an agent that takes action based on a metric rather than having to sift through, dashboards of things to find, a bug, right, or something in that. So the AI agents world is very interesting to think about it, and that's how do we build trust in the platform and the system. So we're working as a pair with the agent in many of these cases.
Absolutely, dashboard fatigue is real. Rodrigue, what does operations mean in the agentic era for you and your team?
Yeah, I think there are several aspects that are quite different from each other in a way when we talk about agents and observability or operations. One is using agents for incident response, for example. Jason touched on this, right? I think that's an extremely promising technology and is also absolutely needed because the more production code we produce with agents, right, in agentic engineering in general, the more we will need to operate it in production. And just if, let's say, if we stick to the same quality level as before, it would just linearly scale the number of incidents. So we have to have something that helps us there. And that's where I'm very optimistic about agents that can help with triaging, root cause analysis, even executing runbooks in predefined scenarios, for example. So that's one aspect. Then there is the aspect of observing agents that are embedded in consumer or business-facing products, right? For example, a customer service agent that's answering customer service requests. That's a different story. There we need to figure out what are we looking at? How do we detect if the agent is drifting in some direction? If we have some sort of regression, right? And due to the non-deterministic nature, it's definitely harder to do that than with traditional software. So that's one thing. Then we have essentially the question of, and I think you touched on this in the beginning, of agent-generated code landing in production, right? Which on one hand means it's more code than ever. And the second is people are not that deep into that generated code as they used to be before with code they've written themselves, right? So we will see that engineers will lose some muscle in terms of really being able to quickly understand code in a high stress situation like an incident. So this is an interesting aspect in itself. It's also interesting to see how topics like maintenance will evolve over time as agents get better, right? And how we position ourselves in terms of this agent-generated code in the future. And then there is, last but not least, there's also this thing where you want to maybe observe agents that produce code, right? So not the output, but actually the process of producing code and seeing if the code produced becomes better, if it becomes more efficient, if it's more reliable, and so on. So these kind of aspects also play a role in terms of having essentially somewhat under control what models are doing within your engineering organization, right?
To give a concept, like how big is Delivery Hero in the engineering organization approximately?
Yeah, I mean, we are globally distributed. In total, we have over 4,000 engineers.
Wow.
And yeah, separated in tech hubs across the world, like Dubai, Riyadh, Barcelona, Singapore, Seoul, Buenos Aires, Montevideo, right? So we have several of these hubs out there, and they're also acting quite autonomously. They have their own way of working, their own tech stack. And that's also what makes this whole setup quite interesting to solve, right? And to support.
How is your role as like VP of Tech Foundations, which I guess is like platforms and developer enablement, and the enablement segment, if we're talking team topologies? How are you experimenting with agents? I know we can assume everybody's writing code a lot with AI, if not exclusively at this point, but more on the observability side. Where are you on that agentic journey? Which is a journey, it's not a light switch.
It's a journey. We're driving adoption at the moment across the group, but particularly in our central teams, both in terms of agentic engineering toolings, such as agentic native IDEs and so on, but also in terms of building an autonomous software delivery agent or system that basically can take a Jira ticket and that's drive it to conclusion alone, right? So these are the things what we're doing. And in addition, we're also looking at what at least I call AI ops, but I'm not sure if that's the right branding here. But what I understand with that is mainly using agents in operations for incident response. That's something that I think is hugely important to get right early on, because otherwise our engineers will just burn out because the time they spend will be shifted to incidents, and that's everybody who's been an on-call engineer at some point in their life understands that this is not an awesome perspective, right? You really want to keep that to a minimum.
And you want to be able to build that trust with that. I guess trust in a robot maybe isn't the word. We throw around trust a lot. It doesn't sound great when I say it that way, like build trust with that agent, but you need to somehow prove that what the agent is doing is what you want it to do, I guess, and understand what it's trying to do.
There needs to be definitely some evidence there, right? Before you give agents the keys to your kingdom in terms of your infrastructure. So I think in the beginning, it's more about supporting with advice and supporting with kind of looking at potential root causes, looking at potential actions that engineers can do, but we'll leave the decision to the on-call engineer to actually act, right? And to actually make that infrastructure change if that's needed. I think the next step would really be to give agents the ability to execute runbooks in well-defined scenarios, right? So let's say you have an application that regularly runs out of memory or whatever. You have that particular scenario that you know is happening from time to time, and you know exactly what you need to do. And it's the thing that the on-call engineer typically does 100% of the time. Then you can essentially allow the agent to execute that, like restarting the application or whatnot, right? So I think that would be the next step. And in the future, couple of years ahead, agents will just become more competent, be able to execute more critical things on their own. And we will allow based on the evidence that we have in terms of what they did before right now. Right now, I think most people would not be very willing to trust an agent to, for example, delete resources in their infrastructure setup. Right? So that's kind of dangerous. We hear these stories from time to time in the news. So you want to be careful with that. You want to approach this slowly in well-controlled environments.
Okay, let's talk about some of the different ways you can do that. So we have a poll, and just to read for those, working while they're listening in, which is totally fine, since we all do. Has your organization adopted tracing for your agents? Yes, no, maybe, I'm not sure the options. While that comes through, Ryan, do you want to explain what that is? What is tracing for agents and which agents get tracing?
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. We talk a lot about how you can trust an agent as you're implementing. And as you start on like step one, you put an agent into place, give it some tools. What's it actually doing? Tracing is going to be the mechanism to let you see how it's reasoning, what tool calls it's using, what it's not using that you think it should, where there might be latency or performance issues, or even security issues. You can do this through a few different ways. But for example, if you use OpenTelemetry, you can trace every step, every request. That lets you play back exactly what happened. And you can derive lots of good metrics and say, how often am I using a certain MCP tool? And does that correlate with the auto remediation outcomes, for example, you're looking for?
Do you not risk tracing burnout if you're tracing everything? And I know OTel is the standard, but doing it for everything, do you not risk just too much information for yourself or for the agents?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that's always the nuance. From Chronosphere's perspective, this is something that we think is really important. We have a control plane to help you only keep the traces that are valuable. You can look at it similarly to a quality control issue, where if you're just making children's toys that have no risk and they're not hazardous, let's just say like a wooden block, right? Nothing you can choke on. You might not want to have infinite nines of quality or reliability. But if you're making, something like an airplane where there's higher risk, you have to treat it differently. I think tracing and agent visibility is the same. If you have a customer service agent, again, just for your kind of side hobby web app, you might not want to trace every request. You might want to trace every 10th interaction or only certain parts of an agent. That might be different in another use case where you want to actually pay and have more visibility.
Just to close out the poll, we had great participation. Thank you to everyone. So has your organization adopted tracing for your agents? 4%, 18%, because I can read 18% said yes, while 30% weren't sure. That's totally fair. This happens a lot. And then more than half said, no, they don't. And that's okay. That's kind of part of what we're doing here today. And we're figuring out how each of those work. So how do you go about setting up that tracing? So I guess let's talk about Google's setup for agentic AI, because I think we all kind of, respectfully to everyone in the room, we kind of assume Google as itself is going to be a bit further along than the majority of companies in their experiments and things, or in their actual adopting at scale. So yeah, please, Jason, tell us.
Yeah, it's a great question, Jennifer. I'll touch a little bit on what Ryan was talking about. If you think of the trajectory of an agent being, what are the external things that an agent does to get to an outcome, and then the reasoning chain being kind of the internal thoughts. It's really about how do we capture all of that information, and then how do we start to sift through that. So for us, what does that tangibly mean? We do a lot of work with evals. So for those listening in, evals are just how do we, determine what an outcome should be for an agent based on an intent or a request, and how do we start to manage that? Because if you think about agentic workflows, an agent could do one step and get to an outcome. It could do 5 steps. And while we may care about some of the the trajectory that the agent has, ultimately we want the request and the outcome to be co-located, right, in the same cohort of things. So that's really where we spend a lot of time, is actually on building the evals, building the data sets for that, because it's not easy. As folks here know, well, if you've never had an agent before, one of the hardest things to do is to build trust in the agent, to deploy the agent. And to do that, what you need training data or test data in order to make that happen. But one of the ways you can do that is obviously with synthetic data. And if you look at a lot of large language models, they both pull on the corpus of public information, but a lot of them are building their own synthetic data sets now. So folks could do that, with tools obviously like BigQuery and even just Gemini out of the box. Ask the question, come up with 500 ways to ask, why is my bill overdue, or something like that. But the other way then is just getting very verbose with tracing and logging. And I think out of the box, I would encourage everyone do that and then start to filter back, because all that information is highly valuable. And if you think about your organization, the agent's use cases, like that is actually kind of what I think is like the secret sauce going forward is what is the agent's interaction with the customer? How is your data improving the customer's interaction for it? So you bring all those things full circle. Once we have those, then we can start to back off and say, okay, great. Now we have enough training data where we can continuously, evaluate our agent when it's running in production. We know when trajectories, don't work out. So to Rodrigue's point, earlier, like agents just tend to make things 10 times better or worse. If you think of an agent that all of a sudden decides it needs to call a database, but it calls the database 500 times, well, like you've put pressure on downstream systems inadvertently with that. But we need the reasoning chain to understand why that happened. Was it that the tool definition, needs improvement? Is there something else that happened as a part of that? But then we can start to move in and like actually build agentic systems on top of it. So that's where, candidly, like a lot of our time gets spent is, how do we actually, build great evals? And then of course in customer and, compliance and regulatory safe ways for that. So, a lot of this isn't actually technology, right? This is business transformation. It's thinking about, customer implications, how we change the agreements with customers and not for Google specifically, for many organizations. But it's the fun part, but also the part where we have to really think about like what is valuable that we're actually servicing the customer with.
When you talk about those 500 calls, are you setting up guardrails to prevent that from happening, or do you set a limit on what an agent can do in a certain time period? How do you prevent that from happening while also wanting to, for the future, understand where it went off the rails?
Yeah, you can. So there's obviously a number of different ways, like where you can set, limits on different things. Like this is where I kind of come back to like great software engineering principles, right? If we're using APIs, like we can set, limits and backoffs on APIs such that we're defending, our services for that. Like great software engineering does not die in agentic engineering. It actually gets enhanced because we've already defended the services that are around the agent. And, sometimes like we may want to have some backoff or, limit the retries within an agent itself. Some of those things that you don't know what you don't know until you deploy it and you see what happens. So that's from for a lot of what I think about is do good software engineering and then let the agents in smaller situations start to pressure test different environments for it. Because in many cases you may have had 95 of your services where you have limits, backoffs and all that. But what we want to find is actually, well, what's the two services that like didn't have that? And sometimes, agents will find those things, right? Because they can execute work significantly faster than we can. But then that means is for operations teams is you have to be on anomaly detection, like as the anomaly is happening, not after it happens, even 10 or 15 minutes down the line in some cases.
Okay. Absolutely. It feels like, how long did it take you to set that up and at a scale where you have less limited employee resources?
It's interesting, like if you go like take agent development kit, which is it's kind of our flavor of how you build agents. Enabling telemetry I think it's 1 or 2 lines in Python.
Wow.
So, a lot of these things, and Ryan mentioned this, even with Langsmith and LangChain, like these frameworks have these things out of the box. It's just not enabled by default. So I think for a lot of folks, it's just making sure that you actually turn it on and then you start to look at the results. And this is where Rodrigo kind of talked about this at the beginning, but like agents, like working on agents, I think is actually more powerful in this model. Because what's happening with that, right, is like you're going to get logs and like tons of logs of information, and we should budget that. We're going to actually get a lot of additional. We're going to spend more on things like logs and tracing and telemetry going forward, and I think that's just an expectation, of how we manage non-determinism. But then let's use agents to sit through that, and use agents to better refine like our prompts and our instructions and like the actual agent design, like. There is a virtuous cycle in this, that we can unlock with 1 or 2 lines of code in many cases for it.
Yeah, and I just want to bring my hot tip I love to mention. If you've been struggling to get observability budgets or SRE budgets for years, say it's for AI. You're more likely to get it. Same with any migrations to cloud. There's a lot of things. Just say it's for AI. It's fine. It'll make it stronger. So how do we actually reach that next stage of agentic observability or agents performing observability tasks, like auto remediation, root cause analysis? What are the challenges to like getting that adoption going? Like you said, there is tracing, or with OTel, it is 2 magical lines of code. That's amazing. But what are other things, and I'm just going to open that up to the floor, of that can help aid this process? How do you decide which agents to deploy first in your agentic observability. It's a mouthful.
Yeah. I'll go very quickly and then cede the floor to Ryu and Ryan. One of the things that I think a lot about is like what are the unwritten things that happen in incident response? And unwritten in this case, right, is like what happens in an incident response room, right? What's the conversation that happens? There's obviously the run book that we follow, but what are the decisions and what's the decision-making process that people actually came to, for how to remediate a problem? And with agents, we can't expect an agent to outperform, us or to, do the same performance of us if we don't give it the information and the reasoning chains that people had in order to, make something happen. So, I think a lot about what are the undocumented things we need to document into like the agents and give to the agent as, additional context or context engineering. So managing the input window. And then once we have that, then I think it is, hill climbing with the agents to, gameplay scenarios, figure out, what worked, what didn't, and then moving forward with that. So again, similar themes around eval and tracing all that, but really, focusing on what is the process, what is the value, and then keeping the human in the loop. Like there's a lot of value in human creativity, even in things like incident response. Let's maximize that and minimize the toil, and those things for it. But Rodrigo, Ryan would love, your perspectives as well.
Please, where do you get started? What do you need? Ryan?
Ryan, you want to go first? Jay?
Yeah, I'll go quickly. I think, to Jason's point, you have to understand the incident response process because a lot of it is people in process. But then also kind of mapping your agent into a harness. So what are the signals that it can get, the types of telemetry, but then also what are the available mitigation actions that can be taken. You don't want to just necessarily let the agent be so creative it can do anything. Put some guardrails in place around that, and then actually measure those guardrails. This will help your confidence. So if you go a few incidents in and you can see, hey, it's trying to do things it shouldn't and it's violating its own guardrails, you might need to make a lot of adjustments. And if you get it to a point where that's not happening as much, you have some stable outcomes, you kind of know you have some use cases solved, and then you can continue to look for new use cases you can have it take on, again, looking at previous incidents. So I think that's, to me, what's important. And then also, if you've been an SRE on an incident call, a lot of times you have one incident commander who's managing other people. I think with agents, a lot of times everyone becomes a little bit of an incident commander, and you're managing teams of agents for some shared outcome. So I think there's also just a mindset shift in how you're approaching the work.
So wait, are you then selecting maybe one or delegating one agent to be an incident commander among agents, or is the incident commander the human?
I think for now you still want human accountability for sure. So I think the roles stay the same, but previously an incident commander might ask an SRE to go analyze all these logs, come back with their findings, plug that in, have a developer working on a hot fix, where now you can have an incident commander who might be able to accomplish that with agents directly, or have those SREs have a much wider footprint and have the agents executing those individual tasks. So a lot of the analysis work where you have to like look through many logs quickly, that's where you're thinking, how can I use these agents instead of just my own capacity and brain power?
Okay. Rodrigo, what are y'all doing? What are your first agents in observability you may be deploying, and how? What are you setting up for them?
Yeah, so maybe something we didn't really touch here, but it's a very simple thing that everybody can do quickly and is already providing a lot of support is in most incident response situations, you have some sort of group chat or video conference, right? Where the incident commander is kind of trying to understand the situation, trying to delegate tasks, trying to do something. And you often have people kind of jumping into that chat or into the call at some later point in time, right? Because maybe they were not available before. And it's usually a very tedious task, both for the people who join as well as the incident commander, to keep everybody up to date on what's going on. So a simple, really simple trick is using an agent to easily summarize what has happened so far. But we did that at Delivery Hero. It's extremely helpful, and similar in video chats. Usually, you already have this kind of functionality. So, for example, in Google Meet, you can easily just get a recap of what was going on. So you don't have to, as an incident commander, spend explaining to people what has happened every 5 minutes, right? You can completely hand that off. So that's good. You could even go so far and have executive communication done by agents in a certain interval so that you have freed up your team to actually look for the root cause itself and to fix the problem, right? So that's the first step, very, very simple step. The next step in our case is we've observed several different players in the industry who want to provide something like an SRE agent or assistant in observability and so on. So you see that from observability companies specifically. I think they have great training data for this and can build awesome products. You see that from hyperscalers like AWS and Google coming up with their own versions, which is great if you're on single cloud on their platform, right? You have startups coming from other angles, such as training on postmortems and runbooks and so on, trying to build something that is knowledgeable about what happened at your company with your tech stack. So it's still a phase where I believe most industry players are kind of experimenting and trying to figure out what is the best solution here. And if you're not one of those companies, I think it's better to just try out what is out there from those players and see if it fits, right? I would not go and try to reinvent the wheel here in terms of agent observability or SRE agents.
I really like that those use cases don't take away the job security of developers and especially observability or SRE engineers. I like the idea that they're focused on the boring, which I think is always a great use case for AI because not that it's important, the communication landscape and updating, but it can be tedious and time consuming. And also you can learn so much by capturing that information for future and help improve those processes and that communication process, not just the technology of it. So I think those are great examples. So you can't improve what you don't measure. I guess, Rodrigo, if you want to start, what metrics are you running on your, again, we haven't decided as a company, as a industry, if we're going to call it agentic ops, if we're going to call it observability agents, or something in between. So how do you measure that?
So currently we're measuring mostly from the business perspective, right? So we are defining business KPIs that are important for our agents, and then we're looking at that and see any deviation there. We do not yet have, let's say, specialized agent observability in place. It's something that we're still looking at, and we did not yet decide on what to use there.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. What other metrics do we have, either Ryan or Jason? What are you measuring?
Yeah, a lot of what I look at in agents kind of, it still comes back to, I think evals primarily. So there's a number of other things we can measure, right, in terms of things that the agent is trying to do. So did the agent accidentally jailbreak? So did it do something it shouldn't have, write into a system where it should have only had read? Those are metrics, right, that we can control with things like gateways, and other kind of security measures. I think I still come back to what is the outcome that we want? How many times did we actually get to the outcome that the agent was supposed to get to? And how do we think about how many tokens does it take to get there? Like I know token economics right now is probably front and center for almost anyone who's working with agents or working to deploy agents. So, how many tokens did it take to get to the destination that we wanted? What's our token per second, rate or token per minute rate in the system? The more we kind of track that, right, I think the more we learn about, agentic behavior. So if it took 50,000 tokens to get there, can we ask an agent to, spend some tokens to improve that? And, are we trying to drive, what's kind of the reason, that we think we can drive this down lower? The other thing I think about a lot is context engineering. So what's actually in the agent's context window? And if we think about measuring that, there's obviously like, hey, what's the percentage of this filled, the time that the resulting window takes. But a lot of it is just, I think probably more what I'll say is like traditional, data engineering metrics, although it is application telemetry at the end of the day. We just have to add, I think, a few more pieces in terms of, rounding out with the things that we're looking at with the agent and then how we manage it. It's like tokens and, how you manage backoffs or like model substitutions as a result of the outcomes that you're trying to drive.
Very good. Brian, what else do you have? What other metrics? There's always more.
Yeah, this one's interesting. I think, again, it's going to vary a lot based on the use case, individual customer, and what you're looking for. But I think there's a few layers. The others touched on heavily. What's the business outcome? So you need some way of measuring what is this agent existing to do, and how often is it actually accomplishing that independently versus how often is it escalating for human approval versus totally failing. And so I think that's the main thing that you're always trying to focus on. And then secondary to that, you're looking at like what's inside of the agent, what model am I using for a use case versus another model, and how do I know, for example, if I'm using too powerful of a model and it's spending too many tokens, and I can actually use a weaker model that's going to be more affordable and get the same results, or is there a threshold where I use a different model? And suddenly my business outcomes are harmed. And so, yes, I might save money, but that's not a worthwhile trade-off. Then I think there's one level deeper that's very technical performance based. This is where, for observability folks, it's very comfortable. In the past, we had like red metrics, golden signals, request errors, duration. This is more on the inference performance, but now it's not just latency or number of requests. It might be latency plus time to first token. Then you might also see not just the number of requests, but the total amount of tokens in that time frame, because each request isn't the same anymore. There might be vastly different amounts of tokens that come through. And then lastly, the evals to say, hey, we don't just have technical errors with 500s anymore. We might have a totally fine performance from a service perspective, but it might be hallucinating or giving a biased answer. And we might want to treat that as an error scenario as well.
Absolutely. And then just not to forget that we need to follow like the basic DORA, mean time to recovery. There's also like mean time to innocent. What isn't at fault when something goes wrong is kind of good to weed things out. And then I think there's always value in qualitative metrics as well. This is a community that traditionally has a lot of burnout because traditionally we never have enough staff for operations and observability and SRE, et cetera. So understanding if they feel like things are getting better, if they feel, even if there's the metrics, but there's also the qualitative of how they are feeling with these new tools. So let's jump into that a bit. Like, let's just briefly, as we wind down, talk about like with the work of the SRE changes, like what does that job profile look like where this human being feels useful still and purposeful?
I'll jump in on this one. I think that one thing we do with all of our AI guided troubleshooting and agentic products is when you go through the workflow, every response and interaction, you have the button to say like, this is helpful or it's not helpful. So as you're using the agents and using the products, you're continually giving feedback. That lets the agents obviously get better and improve, but it also gives you some idea of how staff is responding to that, if it's actually helping their life, or if you're trying to put a new workflow when they're already trying to learn 10 others. I think that's always a critical step. from a technology standpoint, but then also from an adoption standpoint, you need to be doing those same type of checks. And then also making sure that there might be other similar workflows that aren't connected yet. The more you can connect these, the more an individual can worry less about managing all these different technology stacks and more about just getting, more things accomplished.
What else? How is it changing at the place that invented the term SRE, to my knowledge, Jason?
Yeah, one of the things that I'll piggyback off Ryan for, and I think this is true of all roles, is it's forcing engineers to become better experts in the business. And I think that's important, even in SRE, because as we kind of talk about the layer cake of problems that SREs are facing, well, take like the ground truth problem, is the agent, does everything look fine, but like the customer is mad at the agent? If an SRE has to go troubleshoot that, the SRE kind of like needs to have a pretty good foundational understanding of the business that the agent is operating in the context of it. So, one of the examples I actually just wrote about this on Tuesday. You have an agent, but one agent delivers, the customer's information about their last month's bill, and the other one delivers, information about a bill that's 2 months old. Well, one customer is now unhappy because they asked for last month and they didn't get it. You have to know what is the customer support flow for things like bills, and like what does the customer expect, and then start to work back, because is it that the agent was actually doing something that it shouldn't have? Is it that it didn't have access to data upstream? Was the bill never processed? So in that case, like that's not that's not a problem of the actual agent. That is an upstream system problem, but the lights were all green. So you have to be, I think with all roles now, you really have to be not embedded in the business, but be more consultative with the business to understand, okay, what are the problem scenarios that happen? And then how do you actually identify and root cause the thing that made the agent do something that you didn't expect? And that comes with understanding, both the application, but also, the business processes on top of it.
Okay. Rodrigue, how do you empower your SREs and other enablement teams?
Yeah. So first of all, I agree with Jason about the topic that SREs will, or in general, on-call engineers will need to have solid knowledge about how the business works. That's also because the scope of the things that single engineers are producing will increase by a lot, right? So the on-call responders will very likely not know the code that produces the problem, right? They're a little bit detached from the code, which means they need to work on a higher level. They need to know how systems behave, dependencies between systems. They need to know how the flows, customer flows and user flows behave, right? To figure out what's going on. So I think it's a still very likely a very stressful situation, because you have this incident, you need to stop it. But you have to think differently than before. You're certainly not going into some code repository to figure out where the bug is. I think that is something that we will leave behind over time. I also believe that we will need a different organizational structure than what we had before, right? So in most companies like Delivery Hero and others, typically you have teams centered around certain product capabilities, right? Let's say you have a team that is centered around the checkout process. And in on-call, you will have some sort of shift, and there will be one engineer who knows the checkout, right? Because they will be able to handle the incident. Now, this kind of structure will likely not be something that we'll see in the future, because we will not have a single team just looking after a checkout. This single team will look after 5 different capabilities, maybe, or maybe 10. So their scope broadens, which means that the likelihood of an expert of this particular team being in an incident call is very small, right? So that means the on-call setup needs to differ. We can make it a little bit more generic, right? We can have a wider scope for the on-call team, but we can only do that because agents will be able to provide the necessary technical context to the responder, right? So the responders will look at the business flows, they will understand the big picture of how things work together, and with the help of an agent, will be able to resolve incidents in code bases that they do not have deep knowledge of.
It's very interesting getting away from that idea. You built it, you run it, you get it to production. Which I guess it's another level of abstraction, just like platform engineering was before. That's very interesting. We could talk about, I'm very fascinated on how teams will change size. But we are, alas, out of time. If people want to continue the conversation, there's always the Lead Dev Slack community. It's a wonderful community of engineering managers. And if you want to get a copy of Cloud Observability in Action, Manning book, just go ahead and email events@chronosphere.io and just say in the title something like Cloud Observability in Action Manning book and get a free hard copy of that book. I am so grateful to each of you. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Rodrigue. Thank you, Ryan. And thank you, listeners. Good luck on your journey. As you can see, it is a journey. It is not a light switch. You will not be a company that is agentically observable or observably agentic in the near future, but it's a process. So collaborate, make it safe to experiment, and have fun with it. It's exciting times. Good luck, y'all. Have a great day. Thank you.